Like,
even like
see,
So a very good evening to
लैपटॉप में
everyone
जब
present
चेंज
here
करके मैं लैपटॉप
and
से ही
warm
चेंज करने
welcome
वाला
to
हूँ,
guests,
तो पूरा
faculty and all
दिखेगा।
the students present.
हाँ,
Let's embark this
क्योंकि
new
मैं
year
वहाँ
with
भी
a
जाऊँगा और
bunch
यहाँ
of
पे आऊँगा, मतलब
stimulating
यहाँ में
and
चलते
insightful
रहेगा, चलेगा
seminar
ना?
series.
यस चल।
Today, we are privileged to
चेंज
have
करने के लिए
among
मैं
us
लैपटॉप
Dr. Chirag Khara
आई
from
कैन
Panama
आल्सो
University.
चेंज ना the
He
PPT
is a
one,
quantum
then it's okay,
physicist
I'll do it.
turned
Thank you.
sustainability scientist with two doctorates. First, photonics in 2013 from the Institute of Photonic Sciences, Barcelona, Spain. And the second one is in Earth System Science in 2017 from the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry in Germany. His research interests bridge climate science and sustainable development. His work focuses on two interconnected challenges: enhancing global and Indian monsoon projections in response to changing aerosols and developing frameworks to evaluate environmental performance within the constraints of equity and biophysical boundaries. Additionally, he has co-authored India's first comprehensive climate change assessment report released by the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, MOD's Ministry of Earth Sciences, Pune in 2020. He is a contributing author to the IPCC's sixth assessment report, that is AR6 Atlas in 2021. So I invite him to.
Good. Thank you so much, and thank you very much for hosting me to give this talk here. Let's dive right into it. I'm going to discuss the issue of sustainable development and the role of sort of these large global institutions, the UNDP, and so on, in how it's defined and whether that's the right way to understand it. Let's first talk about the most well-known of the development indicators, the Human Development Index, the HDI. It was proposed in the early 1990s, and since then it's become one of the most standard measures of development. What the HDI does is it projects certain parts of the world as the best performers on human development. So North America, Western Europe, mostly Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the global north. So there are certainly, so before I get there, so it's become a standard metric, and it gives some insights into progress, how countries have performed over time, how do they compare with each other. So some of the merits are that you can track progress of countries over time on social goals, and it enables cross-country comparison. But then, as with any index, any composite index, it certainly has its demerits. Some that come from a strictly development perspective, right? Some of these, for example, are, and this is a criticism that applies to any composite index, it's a dimensional reduction. You take a complex system and you try to represent all of that complexity with a single number. Of course, that's a criticism, that's a critique that will apply to any composite index. But then there are others, which is, for example, what are the choice of indicators that constitute your composite index? How do you normalize your indicators? What is the functional form of the Human Development Index? Things like that. But then, that's really not going to be my focus. My focus is the critiques and developments in terms of the ecological perspective. So, what is known, of course, from ever since the HDR was developed, is that it completely externalizes the environmental costs of development. So, carbon footprint, the material footprint, all of that, the ecological damages that come from it, they're all externalized. They don't find mention in the HDR. There is a whole range of work about this. So these are all the way from the mid 1990s until today. There have been different works, scientific works, discussing the problem of the ecological perspective not being internal to the HDI and different ways of handling the situation. I won't discuss all of that. What I'll get to straight away is the culmination of all of that work in which the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, a couple of years ago, they put out a modified HDI. They call it the PSI, so planetary pressures adjusted human development index. Okay, so the PHDI. This is how countries perform on the PHDI. And these are the scores. Reds are poor, blues are good scores. And as you can see, compared to the HDI, the scores of most countries, especially the affluent countries, have dropped. They were much bluer, as you saw in the previous plot. Now you can see that the scores are lower. That is the compensation effect because of the ecological pressure of the development of these countries. And over here, it's dropped even more. These are at least still largely placed. But, and this is important, even after internalizing ecological pressures, it still projects Central and Northern Europe as the best performers. In a sense, the exemplars of sustainable development. The same countries are still being projected. Now, the aim of the PhD, and this is a quotation from the report, is to incentivize change by highlighting countries moving in the right direction in the sustainability sense so that others can learn. That's the formal aim. The PHDI, as we saw, foregrounds Europe and Japan as the aspiration models, as the leaders, according to the PHDI. Okay, which is effectively the same as the HDI. The HDI basically says the same, except that it would also add Australia and Northern Europe to that mix. Over here, they're saying Australia and Northern Europe perform quite early, but Europe and Japan are the countries that are aspirational models. Now, there is a fundamental problem with this picture, and that's this. By the way, I see that the references they're in small letters right there on the bottom left. They've got obscure because of this, but if you want the recording is very clear. All the references are over. So this here is from a very well-known paper, Daniel O'Neill et al. 2018. What they show is this. So there's a lot of information here. Follow me through it. This axis represents social thresholds achieved. So the social thresholds could be a certain level of educational outcomes, a certain level of health, equity, democratic participation. That's what is meant by social thresholds. So a country that has achieved health and education, certain criteria for health and education, and nothing else would be on this around here because it's achieved two social thresholds. On this axis is biophysical boundaries that have been transversed. This is carbon emissions, material footprint, biochemical flows, nitrogen and phosphorus, for example, and so on. Yeah. So this, a company sitting over here, means it has crossed several of these biophysical thresholds which are defined in the literature. The planetary boundaries framework that's become pretty well known now. Okay. So these countries have transgressed more and more biophysical boundaries, and as we go up, it's achieved more and more social thresholds. Now, all the affluent countries are studying right here. Yeah. They've all achieved a great deal. They've made great progress on human well-being, but at the same time, they have transgressed a lot of biophysical boundaries at the per capita level. Okay. So, what? There's more. Most of these countries have not been able to decouple resource use. What I mean is this: we're looking at the US in particular. The one in blue represents the growth in GDP. This one on the bottom, red, represents domestic material consumption. It's the total amount of materials consumed by the economy within its geopolitical boundaries. Okay. This one represents the material footprint, which is the same thing as the domestic material consumption, but with trade included. So it's like a consumption measure. For those of you that are familiar with it, production emissions versus consumption emissions, this would be the analog of production emissions, this one of consumption emissions, meaning all the raw materials used in products which are imported into the country will be counted into the country's use. So that's the footprint. what's important here is that as the GDP has grown, they managed to decouple this domestic material consumption. This is fallen. But the actual material footprint, meaning including trade, has continued to grow. In fact, it's growing faster at a rate that is faster than the GDP itself. Okay, so it is not actually decoupled material footprint from GDP, from its economy. And that's the case for almost all of the affluent countries. Okay, you can see that the green lies above the blue. This is GDP, that's the material footprint. That's Japan, that's the UK, same pattern. The EU as a whole, OECD countries, Australia, for some reason, is an exception. Okay, where the material footprint is actually rising not as fast as the GDP. Now, why that is unclear. I was in touch with Thomas Wiedmann, whose paper this is from. They are the ones who developed this data set, and they're not sure either. So I asked them, Wiedmann and Nimson, they're not quite sure what's going on. What's interesting is China and India, where you would, at least I, thought the material footprint would rise faster than the GDP, the rate of growth would be faster, which it is not. It turns out that the material footprint is actually growing, sorry, this is India. The material footprint is growing much slower than the GDP itself. So there's actually more relative decoupling in the developing countries, these two, than there is in the affluent countries. It's not something which is.
Yes, sir. Can I ask a clarification?
Yeah.
So, you mean here that in India, some of our material consumption
Yes.
is for export,
Exactly.
whereas for its other countries it's imported.
Yes.
So that's why. Now, what's the relation between this and the previous diagram? So PHDI also says the planetary boundary adjusted HDI.
Right.
So is this?
It's used.
So is this a different? That's based on material footprint or what is it?
It is. Actually, I will discuss this in a future slide. I will come back. The material footprint is used in the PHDI, but the way it is used is the problem. That's what I will discuss. So, once again, the PHDI is foreground in Europe and Japan as the aspirational models effectively. But what we've seen from this other scientific literature is that for one thing, these countries are not in the right sustainability space, by which I mean the previous plot of the number of biophysical thresholds exceeded. Okay, so it's not currently in the right sustainability space. And then what we discovered with the decoupling plots or lack of decoupling is they are not even moving in the right direction. So the countries that are foregrounded by the PHDI are neither in the right space, not moving in the right direction. So it really begs the question as to how they can be aspiration models. So what we argue because of this is that the PHDI cannot in fact meet its own stated goal of highlighting countries that are moving in the right direction. That is actually not the case, according to contemporary scientific literature. In fact, and this is the irony, affluent countries appear to be exemplars only because the majority of the world has not followed that developmental trajectory. And that's the irony. So this highlights the dilemma that exists, the developmental dilemma, which is, imagine that everyone in the world aspires to a Nordic lifestyle. If we do that, I'm talking about, this is like a thought experiment. Yeah, this is not reality, a thought experiment. If we do that, well, we could say that we could achieve a certain level of developmental equality, but at the risk of severe planetary breakdown, because of how many planetary boundaries would get crossed. But if we do not aspire, we could have relative planetary stability, but with inequality being entrenched. The current inequality that exists between the global south and global north. And that there is the development dilemma in the context of planetary limits. So to quote Herman Daly, the sort of father of ecological economics, the Nordic countries and the affluent countries as a whole, they don't represent development, they represent overdevelopment, based not on economic growth but uneconomic growth. And in fact, their attractiveness is matched by their impossibility of being scaled to the rest of the world. So why does this dilemma arise? What I'm going to argue is that the definition and measurement of sustainable development is fundamentally flawed, at least the way the PHDI does it, the UNDP's measure. So here's where, in fact, and this is where we'll come to your question, I'm going to discuss the structure of the HDI and the PHDI. So here's the HDI. I think all of you perhaps, or most of you will know this, but I want to lay the basis now. It has three of these indicators: health, education, and income, defined in several ways. They're all socioeconomic indicators. Now, for health and education, there is no natural ceiling to progress. Okay? There's no obvious ceiling to how health you can live, or how much you can learn, or the quality of education, or the quality of health. There's no obvious ceiling to it. And curiously, economics places no sufficiency limits to income. No matter what your level of affluence, you can always aspire to more, and there's no sufficiency limit based on the construct of demand. And so the HDI uses, to give scores, assign scores to countries, it uses a relative scoring system, where you have a whole list of countries. Let's take an example of life expectancy. So you have a country with the lowest life expectancy, which will get a score of 0. You'll have a country, say Norway, which has the highest life expectancy, that will be about 85 years. So this one will get a score of 0, Norway will get a score of 1, and every other country will be back in between. It's a relative scoring system. Okay. So something in between these two. That's what I do. Now the PHDI, what that has done is that it has added one additional indicator, which is a combination of climate and what are called climate pressures and ecological pressures. Climate pressures, the proxy is the per capita carbon footprint, and ecological pressures, that's the per capita material footprint. That's how the material footprint is used for the PHDI.
But the domestic or trade included?
They use the traded one, the material footprint, not the domestic one. Yeah. But for the climate pressures, they use production emissions, not consumption emissions. Because there's not enough data on consumption emissions for many countries. Only a subset of countries still have consumption emission data. Yeah. This is what the PhD has done. And this of course, by the way, this year they take these two and combine it into one. So it's actually just an addition of one further indicator. It's a combination of two indicators. Fine. Now the difference between environmental health indicators and the socio-economic indicators is a very fundamental one. Whereas the socio-economic indicators don't have any natural limits specified, well, the climate and the ecological systems, they have biophysical principles that limit how far you can push the system, perturb the system before it collapses. They're called tipping points. And so these operate on physical principles, physics, ecology, and so these limits exist. What I'm going to contend is that the PHDR uses the same relative scoring system, but this is flawed. They use the same system to score even this indicator, and I'm going to argue that this is flawed. And that's where the problems emerge. So to see this, let's imagine that everyone lived like a country X, in which case we would require the resources equivalent to 5 Earths. Now, this is called the ecological footprint, and this, for example, would be the US. And let's imagine there is a country Y. If everyone scaled up to its lifestyle, we would require the equivalent of 3 Earths. Now, in a relative sense, country Y performs better than country X. But they're both unsustainable from an absolute perspective. Yeah. And just to belabor the point, I'm afraid I probably am belaboring the point, but I think just to make it even more intuitive perhaps, if we imagine two steering cars on a freeway where there's a speed limit of 60, one of them traveling at 240 kilometers per hour, and the other one at 150, but in a relative sense, the second car is driving safer than the first. But in an absolute sense, they're both driving unsafely. The problem is the PHDI is treating the environmental indicators the same way as the socioeconomic indicators, without recognizing that biophysical limits exist for environmental indicators, unlike the socioeconomic indicators. So, in my mind, relative scoring, it's basically saying less unsustainable is the same thing as truly sustainable. It's a conceptual mistake. So, the usual, what I would call the flawed question about sustainable development, the way it's phrased, is which countries provide the highest levels exerting relatively low environmental pressures? And that's why the Nordic countries win out, because their per capita emissions are far lower than the US or Canada for providing the same level of human progress on real indicators of progress. So we need to conceptualize this question with this. Which countries can provide a dignified life to all within planetary limits, if any? That's how we are phrasing this question. Okay, and this within planetary limits is where we are using the concept of absolute biophysical limits to evaluate indicators. So we propose a new metric of sustainable development, and we base it on basically two major principles. One is scalability. If every country had historically lived like a certain country, what would the aggregate environmental pressures be? So, for example, for the US, it might mean the resources of 5 Earths. But for some other country, it might be much less than 1 Earth. Okay. And also, at the same time, we are using absolute goalposts for cumulative carbon dioxide emissions and for the I mean, these numbers come from the literature. I should have given the references another time. So let me show you conceptually how the metric we propose differs from the PHDI. This is what the PHDI is. What we do for our metric is this. We persist with the relative scoring system for the socioeconomic indicators, but we use an absolute scoring system for the environmental health indicators. Okay? Where instead of scoring it against the worst and the best, we score each country against the planetary boundary. The permanent planetary boundary. And here are the results that emerge. When we do this, and we run the same data that the PHDI uses, the results change quite consequentially. Southeast Asia, South America turn out to be well-performing regions. In terms of regions, on aggregate, South America and Southeast Asia are the well-performing regions. India is not quite as poorly performing as before. It's still not performing great, but it's not quite as poorly performing as before. What is very noticeable, particularly consequential, is for Europe. Their performance is lowered substantially because of the scalability, which is embedded into our metric. So, on the EHDI, as we call it, these are the top performers: Panama, Costa Rica, Sri Lanka, Peru, Albania. These are the countries who have achieved a certain level of HDI, but without their income levels becoming so large that luxury consumption has increased their resource use and pollution intensity. That's the meaning. That's how we see it. So, let's look at the trajectories of the highest HDI countries. Let's start with Australia. These are what we look at now are all the highest HDI countries. So Australia is one of them. In red, we have the HDI, as you can see, very high. The Human Development Index of Australia is. At the same time, the EHDI is declining throughout that entire period. And that's because the carbon and material footprint is high, much higher than the planetary boundary. And you see the same pattern replicated for all of these affluent, high HDI countries, where the Human Development Index, the HDI is increasing and it's at very high levels right now, but the EHDIs, which has internalized these climate and material pressures, climate and ecological pressures, is declining for most. In contrast, Albania is one of the top 10 performers. You can see the flip where the HDI is lower than the EHDI for these countries because they have achieved a decent level of development, but with not extraordinary planetary pressures. That's an aberration. And the same pattern replicates for all of the top, I think this is 20 countries, 20 countries, where the EHDI is actually larger than EHDI. And in particular, just to point out, these are the top 3 performers on the index: Panama, Sri Lanka, and Costa Rica. And you can see for, at least for Costa Rica and Panama, the HDIs are also about 0.8. That's the one in red. Even the HDI is greater than 0.8, and yet the EHDI is still good. So, this is the next question, and we are approaching the end now. How do these top EHDI, Panama, Sri Lanka, and so on, how do they actually perform compared to wealthier countries? So that's what we're going to discuss here. So on GDP per capita, okay, these are the top 5, or maybe I'll show it here. These are the top 5 on our metric. Over here, we're showing the average of all the countries with an HDI between 0.7 and 0.8, and so on, pointing between just these values and then between these. So these are the highly developed, very affluent countries. So the GDP per capita for these 3 is actually lower than even this one. These 2 countries, they actually belong in this group. These 2 actually belong in this group. Okay. So, but the other indicators are much more interesting. Life expectancy. As you can see over here, some of these countries are actually outperforming the group to which they belong. This is the average for the 0.7 and 0.8 HDI group on life expectancy. Some of these are actually performing at the level of wealthier countries, average of wealthier countries. Yeah. This stands in even stronger contrast when it comes to, in greater relief, when it comes to schooling, education, the other component of the HDI, where you can see for many years of schooling, many of these countries actually well outperform the group to which they belong, and some of them are actually exceeding the average of the even higher HDI. Similarly, for expected years of school. But here's the next slide, is the real crux of the issue. Their performance actually rivals countries that are wealthier than them in many cases, but with extremely low per capita carbon and material footprints. Okay. So the carbon footprint is, on the whole, for most of them, even lower than the lowest HDI group, and the same thing for the material. This is the reason that they perform so well on the EHDI, the metric that we developed. Okay? And in fact, we see that this is real, that they have in fact achieved a certain level of human well-being, but without exerting undue planetary pressures. Now, our results actually converge with 2 other papers very recently, that have come out recently, in 2020 and 2022. Both of these papers were premised on income sufficiency principles. As we know, there is no such thing in the real world, but they premised their metrics, by putting a constraint on income. And then they found that the countries that performed less on the metric were much the same as the ones we've got through a different concept of scalability. So the question becomes, how have these countries, the top EHDI countries, achieved their performance? Are there lessons to be learned? That's the key question. And this is in fact precisely the question that we're working on now in a collaboration with scholars from those countries. So we've taken 3 countries and we've got collaborators from each of these countries. And one thing is, are they naturally endowed? If they have a whole lot of resources, in that case, that's not scalable. It allows that country to perform well, but it's not very well something that other countries can benefit from. And in Costa Rica's case, in fact, they have a great deal of hydropower. A lot of their energy generation, electricity generation, is from renewables. So the carbon footprint is low because of that. For the others, it's unclear whether there's any natural endowment that we can identify, which should explain, but it's something we're working on. The other is, are there interesting policy interventions that have actually worked? And in each of these cases, there are. So for Costa Rica, famously, they reversed decades of deforestation with very interesting policies. Ecuador, of course, was what the rights of nature in Ecuador is probably it was one of the pioneers, if not the pioneer, of rights to nature, which they encoded into their constitution. And one of our co-authors on this paper that we're writing is in fact a lawyer. So she in fact worked in opposing mining on a market law, arguing on the basis of rights of nature, not rights of the people living on that land. It was very, and they actually won the case. So it's actually worked in practice also. And in Cuba, education and health intervention famously. But of course, just saying that these policies happen is not sufficient. What is socio-economic condition? What was the political context which allowed policies to come about? Now, if those circumstances are so specific to the country that they can't be replicated, then it begs the question whether that's really scalable. Now, that's what we're working on. Cuba, for example, is a special case. The political context of Cuba is special in the history of nation states. And so now that is certainly not something we can replicate in another context. But you can still ask the question whether the kind of policies that were developed is at least in theory possible to replicate. Now those are, but whether the political context will allow that to happen is of course a separate issue. So here is the summary of the key points. Most current metrics of sustainable development are not, in our opinion, a real alternative. They offer the illusion of an alternative. We are proposing scalability becoming a central tenet of sustainability. And this reconception redirects attention to a set of global south countries that do not usually feature in the global debate on sustainable development. Costa Rica does to a greater degree than some of the others, but certainly Sri Lanka or Tunisia and so on are not countries which are usually talked about. As with any work, there are caveats which I will discuss. Just because there is scalability, there may be scalability in principle, certainly doesn't mean that it can be necessarily effective. Right? So development happens within a certain socio-economic and political framework, and so the in-principle scalability we discussed is not to be construed as necessarily scalability, or that is what we are claiming. We are not. We cannot. Many of these countries, Sri Lanka, for example, do face several challenges, economic challenges, political challenges. Sri Lanka is a case in point, both political and economic challenges. So, and most of these countries do not really represent an alternative development model. Certainly not an alternative to the concept of development. That's certainly not. But with perhaps arguably the exception of Cuba, none of these countries really represent an alternative to the alternative development model. And at the same time, the pressures of development are in fact increasing among these countries, because they still buy into the perpetual growth paradigm. And so, even though they may be scalable to some degree now, doesn't mean they will remain that in a decade from now if they continue if they seek perpetual growth. So, concluding thoughts, I want to be very clear about one thing. We are not proposing simply merely replacing Nordic countries with Costa Rica, Sri Lanka as aspirational models. That is not the take-home message. What we are instead saying is that metrics of sustainable development have to be reimagined, not retrofitted. The PHDI is a retrofitting onto the HDI. That's not going to be sufficient. They need to be reimagined. And of course, there are proposals out there. The donut framework, for example, K-Draper. But these metrics need to be conceptually enhanced, and their methodologies need to be updated. And the last point, we would contend that we must rethink what we consider a developed country, a developed nation. The way I look at a developed country is that it can provide a dignified life while remaining within the Earth's capacity to provide. And by that definition, the Nordic countries represent, as Hermé put it, overdevelopment coming from uneconomic growth, not aspirational values. And perhaps I'll just leave that for you to read. It's a borrowed wisdom from Sherlock Holmes. I'm a fan, and I'm open for discussion.
Questions? I have two questions. The first one is on the growth per capita that you have included in your
इसका zoom out कर zoom in कर अच्छा ये करना है
I'm a PhD student at the Center for Climate Studies. I'm working on energy storage. I just wanted to know how the limits of the
Somebody
growth
किसी
per
का
capita,
मैं
if
बैठता
it
हूँ
discusses how the limits are calculated, because at least to my mind it seems to be some subjectivity to assessing something like this. The other thing is that the way that you showed that some of the interventions that Costa Rica did was bringing in afforestation. So I understand that the scalability index that you're trying to come up with is to see if any of this intervention can be sort of realized in a different country. But are you also considering the fact that maybe this afforestation intervention happened in Costa Rica because of its existing, say, social, environmental, economic, conditions, and maybe to realize the same thing in a different country would require different sort of understanding. Say, suppose the investment that would be needed to do afforestation in a different country may not be the best way of, say, doing better on your index. So, are those sort of arguments also being considered in your
Absolutely. So I'll answer the second one first. That was what I was talking about. Policies development happens in its own socio-economic context and its own political context. Without studying that context, it makes no sense to say that this has happened and therefore it can be done somewhere else. So the question is, what is the context in another country would allow that to be adapted, not adopted, but adapted to its local conditions. So this is the case for any complex systems issue, right? No context is the same. That's basically the definition of a complex system that we can draw. But can we still, despite that, derive some lessons which can be modified suitably for different set of circumstances? What I would say is also this, which is, it is, to my mind, easier to imagine adapting ideas from other global south countries than adapting ideas from global north countries because they just have a lot more capital to invest into certain technologies. And when you don't have that, it may be better to look horizontally rather than vertically. That's one way of saying it. As for the first one, the material footprint, it's subjective, very much. But it comes from a certain science behind it, or the science can be defined. For example, the material footprint, right now the understanding is you could extract about 50 gigatons, billion tons of materials per year. Now, 50 gigatons, that's a nice round number. How can it possibly be a? But the question, when we know the material footprint is basically stuff like construction minerals, metal ores, biomass, fossil fuels. We know where they are available. We have a general sense of how much is there, how easy is it to extract, and so the total amount. And therefore, if you wanted to last for, say, 500 years, how much can you extract per year, which is actually technically possible and economically viable. That's sort of a complex analysis through which these numbers arise. So there is subjectivity, but it is based on data, not just hypothesis.
Hello sir, myself John Andy, and I'm a PhD first year student from Sitara. So my doubt is regarding the ecological indicators that we are looking at is carbon footprint as well as materials consumed. So the thing is, aren't we focusing on one particular environmental impact when it comes to carbon footprint? Why aren't we looking at, we should also look at water footprint, ozone depletion, eutrophication potential, acidification potential. There are so many environmental impacts that is not considered in this particular indicator.
That's right.
And the following thing is, even when it comes to materials consumed, when we do a whole life cycle assessment, there are two other aspects that are missing probably in this indicator, which is the waste that is probably being produced. Some countries may use less materials but may produce more waste. That is probably not accounted for. And then the energy consumption, interestingly, you said fossil fuel is also included in the materials consumed. But overall, the energy consumption of the country also needs to be included, probably, in my perspective. And that's why that is the purpose of a life cycle assessment of any particular process, product, or organization. So that is one thing that I wanted to ask. These indicators would it be considered? And probably that was lacking the limitations as well. The second thing is.
I'll go one by one. All right. I've already forgotten your first question. So, okay. Let's go back to this. PHDI? Yeah. Where is the PHDI? Over there. Right. So this is the PHDI, and this one is the EHDI. You're absolutely correct that a lot is missing. First, I'll say this. It's a long answer, but I think it's still a very good answer. Every model is wrong, but some are useful. Every composite indicator is going to be wrong, but some of them are still useful. Yeah. Every time you try to make something more comprehensive, you will always find that there's more you can add. I was having an interesting discussion with some of the others earlier today. The question is it useful? And I would argue that it's useful despite all of the stuff that is missing. First thing about why we did it this way. The motivation for this work was to show the flaws in the logic of the PHDI, the conceptual problems with the UNDP's PHDI. And so we basically used the exact same framework, but we integrated historic responsibility, scalability, and planetary boundaries into it. And that's why the basic mathematical structure is the same for the PHDI and PHDI. We've not added anything more, but we've taken the exact same thing and implemented it with the concept of scalability and planetary bounds, absolute goals. Yeah. So that's why we're not actually proposing a new composite index. We are correcting the methodology of the PHDI the way we understand the system in the sense of ecological and climate pressures. Okay, so that's why we've kept the same data and mathematical structure. Okay, that's it. Now, the ecological indicator, the ecological pressures, you're right. Environment is a whole huge thing. Carbon footprint and material footprint are just two. The carbon footprint is, of course, directly connected to the climate system. The material footprint is a proxy for various other planetary boundaries. Why? Because the more you extract, that includes a water footprint. The more you extract, that includes changes to biogeochemical flows. So that's yet another planetary boundary. It involves mining and disposal, which involves ecological impacts. So the material footprint is not a planetary boundary. It's a proxy for many other planetary boundaries. Yeah. So it is missing a lot. It's a proxy rather than this one is direct. Carbon footprint is direct. The material footprint is indirect.
Yeah. So yes, sir. So the thing is, today we are saying that PHDI has some issues. Tomorrow we may have a talk where PHDI has issues.
Sure, absolutely. That's the nature of science.
So the truly sustainable thing is an iterative thing.
Absolutely.
And the second, one more thing is the waste consumed. Probably, if you consider it to this particular indicator, I think it would be very useful. And the last thing is,
Again, you're asking too many questions, so I'll just stop here. About the waste, right? When we say that there's a limit, there's a biophysical limit on material use, the 50 billion tons, that in a sense encodes both the damages from mining the materials and the damages from trashing the planet from after use. So in that sense, it actually encodes damages on both ends. It's a proxy once again. Yeah. Again, I was talking to Omkar, and what is a proxy for the work that he's doing? It's not direct, it's a proxy. It's the nature of the beast when you're trying to encode something as complex as a social ecological problem. It's a wicked problem.
one last thing is, for Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka is considered as one of the topmost countries in this list. The political turmoil, that component, doesn't it become very strong because Sri Lanka adapted to organic farming in 2019, because of which they eventually faced this disaster, which the political turmoil. This was one of the biggest reasons that it happened, but it also reduced the carbon footprint. So, is that sustainable? So that is something which is a strong point that needs to be infused into this indicator, probably because of these kind of.
The carbon footprint data and material footprint data we're using is from 2021, at which point those issues would not yet have affected the level of the economy and therefore the footprint. But other than that, you are very right. Again, what you really need is something that includes far more about what makes your experience on this planet sustainable or not. Now, if you're well within planetary boundaries, but living in a place which is ravaged by war, that's not a sustainable situation. But no, neither the PHDI, certainly not the EHDI, none of them account for any of that. In fact, most composite indicators are not going to have war zone, citizen or not, right? What is the level, what is the quality of democracy in a given country? Now, if you reduce democracy to electoral politics, then most countries can perform well. But if you see democracy as a larger beast, are you actually participating in decision making that affect your well-being? Well, by that measure, many countries will go very poorly, right? But it's a very complex thing to try and encode into any index. So there'll always be a whole lot missing. The question is it still useful, and does it give you a baseline to reach further? Now that the reason we are discussing Sri Lanka even is because it got foregrounded by this. And now we can look into whether Sri Lanka indeed represents sustainability in the larger sense. And we may come to the conclusion it does not. It may represent environmental sustainability, but it does not represent political sustainability, right? So it gives us a baseline, a different baseline from the Nordic countries to discuss what is sustainable or what is not. That's why the last slide made specifically the case that we are not saying replace Nordic countries by Sri Lanka or Costa Rica as aspiration models. Not at all. I'll just go back to that. I think this is important. This is not our aim to merely replace them by these. The aim is to reimagine metrics and group conceptually and methodologically. So that's why we are not saying that EHDI is the definitive answer. We're saying there are serious problems we found. We're saying that these could be some directions of work and that more needs to be done. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Om Damani with computer science, also associated with CPS and Sitara. So just before the Sri Lanka example in maybe talk is completely wrong. I mean, the sequence of events that you have described, but maybe we can talk about it later. Every once a year in one Sitara seminar, this always comes up and we can understand. So could we just go back to that previous slide? You had this methodology. So against planetary boundary, could you just tell us how do you evaluate, normalize them? So is it just 1 upon the number of the boundary, or what is your formula for that? And
oh, yeah, right. Yes. Yeah. So basically, all those that are, what we do is, we take the per capita footprint, multiply it by the global population, that's the scale, and see what would be the total emissions or total material footprint at the global level if everyone lived with a lifestyle of a citizen from India or the US or Costa Rica. Right? So India's per capita footprint, carbon footprint is 2 tons. So if all 8 billion people live that way, the global emissions will be 16 billion tons. That's what it is. So we do that for every country. Then we see whether, if we take India's case, whether the 16 billion tons, how that compares against the planetary boundary at the global scale.
it's that same as the per capita resources. This is still not clear how that, how would that be different from your, it's just not clear to me.
Yeah.
So finally, per capita material consumption, why is it not proportional to just that? Because all other multiplication you are doing, they all cancel out in this relative ranking. So how does your ranking differ from the per capita?
Not quite. What will happen is this. By our logic, in the relative logic, this will get a score of 1 and that will get a score of 0. Yeah. In our logic, neither will get a score of 1 nor 0.
Right, but what will be their score? So given that Earth is 1, so I'm asking what are the scores?
So it's like a ratio, yeah. It is like a ratio, and then normalized in a certain.
No, with these numbers that you have, 5 Earth, 3 Earth. So the baseline is 1 Earth. So what is the number? What value will that is?
That would be 1/3 for this one and 1/5.
So that's what I say. It's just 1 upon the number of
Just a slightly refined way of doing that.
But the other question, and are these 5 variables combined with equal weighting? Like HDI is just a simple additive.
Yes.
So then
It's a geometric mean.
So it's a geometric mean of all the 5 variables.
4. Like I said, even the
carbon and those two go back together.
Yeah.
With equal weightage.
Correct. That's right.
So within that box, maybe many of the other things being mentioned could also probably come without affecting the overall structure.
Yeah.
Some names of the countries were being discussed. So I was just wondering where Bhutan stands in this. Because we hear a lot about Bhutan,
Right.
other things. So where does it fit?
I don't know if you'll be able to see it because it's so small. On the map, I mean. So this is the map. Now I think it's almost impossible to see. There it is. Not so well, but not terrible, not so well, because the HDI is still not very high. See, it's a combination of the HDI and the environmental pressures. The environmental pressures are low for Bhutan, but so is the HDI. Whereas for these countries, the HDI is much higher, but so is the environmental pressures. And that's what is happening over here. These countries are not being penalized for their environmental pressures. They have very little, but their HDIs are generally low. That's why they perform poorly even on the R metric.
So the other question I had was that India and China seem to be in the same color zone,
Roughly, yeah.
whereas our realities both with respect to I think, HDI as well as environmental pressures are very different. So I'm just wondering whether there is any issue with the data used or
Yeah. So China's environmental pressures are much higher, but so is their HDI. India's HDI is
So
about
it compensates
0.65,
for each
yeah,
other.
yeah, yeah, which is both a merit and a demerit at the same time. So they have, I think China's is about 0.75, whereas India's is probably 0.65, thereabouts. So the HDI is higher, so are the pressures, so I think they basically have compensated.
And in case of Canada, I mean, I don't think they would have a lot of environmental pressure in the sense so much of resource available as compared to the population.
Yeah,
So
true.
still they are lower than
Yeah.
Europe and many other parts of the world.
Canada's material footprint and carbon emissions are actually higher than the US.
They will be in the same ballpark range.
They're higher. Their projected energy consumption is definitely higher and probably in some way connected to it being an extremely cold country. So their energy requirements are higher, to be sure. But the material footprint is also higher for Canada. And the difference is evidently enough for that to be a consequential difference, I think.
Yeah, hi, my name is Pankaj Siksare. I teach in Sitar. So I actually have a very fundamental and perhaps very naive question. Is there a possibility going forward giving up our obsession with indices? I mean, can we live in a world that has no indices? Because the question of, I just don't, I mean, maybe it's my, we are so much into this number crunching game with index creating. So, or maybe that we cannot live without these indices. The question of whom is it useful for? If one was to argue, so much effort has been made in creating this HDI, and we've probably been barking up the wrong tree all these years. And now then there is this PHDI, and then EHDI. So, I mean, can we imagine a world without indices? I mean, is that possible?
Yeah. It's,
Maybe you're the wrong person to ask. Maybe you're just the right person to ask that.
I would like to say wrong so that someone else can take the question. It's actually also goes back to a discussion I was having. I had a long discussion with Gopal here and keep referring to it again and again. But we've started with the premise that it's useful and then work on it. But you're questioning the premise, and that's always uncomfortable for me, especially right now. Perhaps a related question to ask is, can we give up our obsession with perpetual exponential economic growth? Now, I don't know whether that is. I mean, as I say, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And perhaps as long as there is capitalism, or more specifically the issue of exponential growth, and therefore escalating ecological pressures, we certainly have to know where we stand with respect to that. So in that sense, functionally, I would say it's important, but perhaps I'm saying that because I haven't really thought about what you're asking. And I really haven't. So perhaps it's something I really need to reflect on. What purpose does it serve? And therefore, are we really contributing anything that will have value beyond just writing it out?
May I ask?
Yeah, no.
We both. I wish we had this earlier.
So I have asked too many questions to you today. So might be a last one for today, but I will be questioning. So just continuing the discussion what Pankaj asked. So do you feel it's a good idea? So instead of having one global or at a planetary level targets and all, because we are continuously discussing about context, it's a context specific. Having the targets at a country level, ensuring that those are within limits, and just sharing the success and failure stories probably. So instead of meeting together at the start of the year for setting the targets, probably at country level you are having targets, and whether by achieving those, what challenges you faced, and coming together and sharing those success and failure stories, which might be useful for the countries of the same geography, having the same situations, having the same socio-political, economical challenges and all. Do you feel like this is like idea, because you say I don't know whether we can escape those indicators kind of thing, whether this may happen in future, and then we can escape at least from these global indicators and all, country specific things.
What's your question?
Like, I'm asking that because Pankaj said that whether there can be a solution of, can we go away from indicators?
So the same question.
Yeah.
My
So,
answer is the same. I would like someone else to answer it.
no, but then I'm putting a scenario where having country specific targets, so that we can escape that discussion of context specific.
Yeah.
And then simply coming together at a global level for exchanging in terms of success and failure stories, where other countries can adopt that.
That's very optimistic. Exchanging
I
and
understand.
happening.
Maybe I should.
But to answer the question you seriously, the NDCs, NDCs, the nationally determined contributions are exactly that, right? Each country puts forward the proposal of what they can do given their current context. Now, whether they actually achieve that is another matter. The other is the SDG dashboard, the Sustainable Development Goals, where you have the 15 or 17 targets, and then under each one you have a whole set of indicators, and each country sort of acts according, tries to measure its own success, progress on each of those indicators. And it's not like every country uses the same indicator. They use the indicators that are relevant to their context. So in that sense, both the NDCs and the SDGs, they represent, I think, if I understand you, the approach that you're suggesting.
Actually, my question is about the flexibility making the indexes, like which is a rigid one, like the SDI plus so and so. So, is there any thought in at a global stage that we need to provide some flexibility within HDI? So that's
Some
flexibility,
Okay.
like to accommodate the qualitative parameters we might be Professor Prabhakar asking.
I would say not within the HDI, because the HDI has become very standardized, but there are others. There's something called the Happy Planet Index. And that's those, it takes some quantitative indicators and some subjective, relatively subjective indicators and combines them. In fact, the Happy Planet Index gives similar results to what we've got. I didn't mention it because of the qualitative nature of an aspect of it, but it actually gives some similar results. Then, the moment you have subjective indicators, again, we have Omkar and I, we talked a lot. The complexity increases and it becomes difficult to imagine what's an appropriate indicator that's relevant, pertinent, complex. Wicked, problem.
So, sir, I have one. So, the thing was the political or these kind of things are very hard to parameterize. Hai? So, we have some indicator like happiness index, what you said, happy world, and then there are press freedom index. Is there possibility of incorporating them into, or if they are into totally different scale?
Incorporating them into what?
Some index which is development plus this kind of like press freedom index or happiness index.
Yeah, there are many such. I mean, the most comprehensive or rather well-known comprehensive one, let's put it that way, is the donut model, K3, where she has, it's become very popular now. So she sees it, visualizes it like a donut, where the center is indicative of social welfare, social progress, and the extremes outside the donut is whether we are living within environmental limits. And that takes in a lot more complexity. It's a very interesting concept. And possibly that goes along the lines of
It's by whom? Once again.
K3.
Okay.
I had a very small question. I wanted to know the reason of Chad and Niger being the worst performing.
Sorry?
I wanted to know the reason of Chad and Niger being the worst performing out of the African nations in the
Yeah.
ESDI that you were presenting.
Yeah.
And I couldn't find a reason for it.
Yeah, no. I can't give you specific reasons, but in general, the poor performance for sub-Saharan African countries is because the HDI itself is, remember it's the HDI and the environment pressures.
Yes.
So when one of them is low, the whole index score will be low.
No, that I understood, but then I couldn't.
Why specifically? This compared to that?
Exactly.
I know. We'll have to look at the data carefully in order to do that, but I haven't looked at it that carefully. Actually, the data have many problems, by the way. Even the material footprint data, it's a very complex calculation. So the data in particular for these countries is very poor because it includes traded data. And that's very poor. So sometimes it's a little difficult to interpret, or whether you can really try to interpret it very closely because the data quality is in question. It's much higher quality for the larger countries because their trade and so on there's just more data available on that. So that's my interpretation here. By the way, South Africa, the material footprint data is very strange. And again, I was in touch with Tommy Weidman. They didn't know like this because the whole methodology is so complex that they're not yet being able to figure it out.
So it's all formed by the data that they are publicly declaring, or do you have other sources? Because I don't feel that most countries can give you
No,
the
there's basically just one data set for material footprint. Carbon footprint is easier to get, more sources, and they are made largely consistent.
Yeah.
Material footprint is not easy.
Because again, the whole problem with the Niger basin would be that it is most of the footprint that you count for the country itself is due to foreign factors. So where do you count it, in the Niger basin or because of the external factors? So that means USA would be even lower.
Yeah.
USA, Saudi, etc.
Yeah, it could be. It's like international flights, where you have different emissions, especially if it's a flight company sitting in Saudi Arabia, or whatever, Qatar, let's say. But the flight is going from India to France. Now, where will the emissions be attributed? That question exists even for carbon emissions. International shipping, you don't know where to put the emissions because the flagship, the country with the flag will be something, the ship is going somewhere else.
No, I just want to know where does ESGI put it? Where do you attribute this?
They've just taken the data. So the real question is, how have they calculated it? Did I understand the question correctly? Are you asking where the material is being attributed? I don't know, because that's the data set itself that we pick up. But the data set, generating it is extremely complex. So I have absolutely, in fact, I doubt will know specific answers. Like I said, for South Africa, their numbers were very badly off, and they had no idea why. It's so complex. It's a planet model. There's a million lines of code. If something goes wrong, it's hard to pinpoint what's happened. Pick it up. And in fact, I've seen codes in models where in block letter somebody is written commenting saying, somebody please fix this, it is wrong. And it's been lying there for years because nobody knows how to fix it. The person who wrote it was a postdoc and left many years ago, and no one now understands the code well enough.
Hello, sir. Sir, maybe a basic question, but I wanted to know what would be a ideal achievable EHDI target score for different continents or different clusters of countries, and what's the current average of EHDI in this particular chart?
The average is about 0.7, which is roughly about the HDI also. Let's talk about it in terms of the HDI because those numbers are better known than the EHDI. Generally speaking, an HDI of about 0.75, once you exceed that, your environmental pressures tend to grow faster than your progress on human welfare indicators. That's when your environmental pressures grow disproportionately. Because by the time you achieve 0.75 for HDI, your health and education, you're already doing pretty well. It's very hard to make progress there. Okay, what you make progress in is income, and that becomes luxury income, and that luxury income is what gets you heavy carbon emissions, ecological pressures. Okay, so actually about 0.75 is a threshold which I think most countries can aspire to, in order to have a decent level of human well-being, but beyond that, environment pressures catch up rapidly.
So, sorry for a follow-up question. This is maybe a situation where if a country is declining and if you consider the per capita income is falling and thereby the ecological footprint is also declining. But technically it is more better in the EHDA country. Am I right in understanding this?
You will be right if you're taking the rate of change. Here we are not. We are not using the rate of change. And usually in those countries, except very few countries, the decline is not sustained. Like COVID, there was a decline for 1 or 2 years, but then it bounced back. That's usually the case for those countries. If you do take the rate of change, it's exceedingly important to take a correlation with GDP. If the correlation is positive, you have to be very careful because then, if your carbon footprint is declining, it might be because your GDP is declining, your economy is doing worse. But if you get a negative correlation where your carbon footprint is declining, although your GDP is increasing, that's when you have a real decoupling. So whether you're decoupled or not, the correlation between GDP and your footprint becomes very important to us. Otherwise, you get a lot of potential.
Anyone else?
Okay, all right, then we'll close.
Thank you so much for such an engaging talk. And this is the first talk of the semester, and I think you have provided enough food for thought for the rest of the months coming in the semester. I would like to thank you for coming here and then stimulating this discussion. I mean, development is something that all of us are trying to understand, whether it can be measured, whether there can be indices, or how we can appreciate this concept in the first place. That itself is a challenge. So this will provide some more thought and more fuel for the thought, I would say. So on behalf of Sitara and all of us, I would like to extend a small memento. I would request Omkar. I think he has got highest mentions today. So he can do the honors.
So this is also fun if I can show you a photograph and can give a reference that I can give you in case you forget me.
You're the last person. That's all the questions.
So this is a carving stone. So we hope not to increase in the environmental.
I appreciate it. That was one of the first things I was thinking about.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.